Back. We're finishing the book of Joel tonight. We're in Joel chapter 3. So I have a bit of review. We ended up doing a lesson like every 10 days or so, which is like just enough time for you to start to forget what we talked about between lessons. But right, think all the way back to like chapter 1, which we talked about. Joel prophesies about the soon coming what? Wilma, were you even here for chapter 1, or were you sick then too?
I was
Or you were on vacation then, I think, right?
But I did watch you guys.
Okay.
That doesn't mean totally take away I've got brain fog. Let's put it that way.
I was just,
It's really been bad.
I'm not going to count the review section against you. So. Joel prophesies about the soon coming day of the Lord. But, right, what does the day of the Lord entail? Judgment, right? The soon coming destruction of Judah or judgment of Judah in what year?
What year?
587, 586 BC. Right, all of Jerusalem was told to do what? By the priests?
Repent.
Yes, but how did that manifest? Fast, right? All of Jerusalem was told to fast in chapter 1 with the hope that they might be spared, right? And we got into that in chapter 2. Obviously, we know from our vantage point in history, they were not spared. And then also in chapter 2, Joel sort of shifts his prophetic time emphasis, not his prophetic focus, as we argued. And he shifts his focus to the blessings that all of the what would receive. Well, look at the very end of chapter 2. The very last sentence of chapter 2.
The remnant.
Remnant, right? Okay, yeah, different translation, but right, the idea of like the faithful, right? Right, Joel shifts his prophetic timeline, right? We talked about there's sort of the immediate prophetic timeline of the judgment of Judah. There's sort of a New Testament prophetic timeline where he gets into, just as the faithful remnant of Judah would experience the restoration of Judah after Judah's judgment, so too the faithful remnant can one day look forward to God's Spirit being poured out on all the earth, which we said was Day of Pentecost. And then there's even sort of an eschatological element to his prophecy where he's talking about the moon turning to blood and all this sort of revelation type of language. But the focus is on the remnant and the blessings that they would receive. And I guess I just sort of gave away the last 3 answers. This includes the restoration of Judah's crops, which is what element of the timeline? Right? Is this here or is this far off?
In their time, you mean?
Yes.
It would be a 50-50 chance. If I say near, it'll be far. If I say far, it'll be near.
Well, I mean, think about this, right? Think about this. I mean,
Crop has to be pretty quick.
I would say near during their time.
Yes, right.
Time.
Yes, because we dated the book of Joel to very soon before the destruction of Judah by Babylon, and so right, this is sort of what the immediate audience would have been, right. This is the element of the prophecy that most applies to the immediate audience, the restoration of Judah's crops after the judgment of Judah. And then he gets into the pouring out of God's Spirit on all flesh, which is what element of the prophetic timeline?
Or
Yes, but specifically, like, what is this in reference to?
end time?
Well, no,
Not that far?
no, just right. God's Spirit poured out on all flesh. What does that sound like?
Oh, well, sounds like the day of Pentecost.
The day of Pentecost, right? So this is the New Testament sort of emphasis of the timeline. And then we have the sun turning to darkness and the moon turning to blood, which is, Lester?
Revelation.
Revelation, right? This is the end times element of the prophecy or the eschatological prophetic timeline. Joel sort of balances these three different, as I call them, prophetic timelines or prophetic emphases, right? But the focus always remains the same. It's on the blessings that the remnant would receive. The remnant of Judah would receive, would more than likely live to see the restoration of Judah, and the remnant, in the New Testament would see God's Spirit being poured out on all flesh, and then the remnant, at the end of the world, it says, I will show wonders in heavens and the earth, and they would get to experience this, and then ultimately experience, Jesus coming back. So, with the review out of the way, let's wrap up Joel, because we only have like 21 chapters left, 21 verses left, 21 verses. So we're going to read the first 8 verses. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. They have cast lots for my people, have given a boy as payment for a harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. Indeed, what have you to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coast of Philistia? Will you retaliate against me? But if you retaliate against me, swiftly and speedily I will return your retaliation upon your own head. Because you have taken my silver and my gold, and have carried into your temples my prized possession. Also the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem you have sold to the Greeks, that you may remove them far from their borders. Behold, I will raise them out of the place to which you have sold them, and I will return your retaliation upon your own head. I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, to a people far off, for the Lord has spoken. Okay, so once again, 50-50 shot here. So true or false, right? The captives talked about here, right? We're specifically looking at verse 1. For behold, in those days and at that time when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, this is in reference to the captives from the captivity in Babylon. Or in other words, right, the captives that got taken by Babylon were captive in Babylon and then returned from Babylon. True or false, that's who this is in reference to.
True.
Anyone else want to answer now?
There's only one answer left. One is to be right.
I'm gonna go out on the limb and say false.
False, right? So I think we can be pretty sure that this isn't necessarily talking about those specific captives that were specifically taken to Babylon and held in Babylon and returned from Babylon. And I'll go over some of the reasons why. So first of all, right, there is sort of it's a kind of up for interpretation what this word even means. So the Hebrew word here, translated in the New King James and probably most translations, it says captives, but it can also be translated as fortunes. And there are scholars who argue that that's what's being used here. Right, and this would make sense if this is what is being used. Because, right, chapter 1 focuses on the economic consequences of God's judgment, right? All the the vine and the apple tree and the fig tree and the palm tree and all this stuff, it doesn't bear fruit and the water dries up, and right. And then chapter 2 focuses on sort of the reversal of this, and the restoration of Judah's agriculture and economy. So it would make sense if this is talking about the fortunes of Judah being restored. But if it is talking about actual people captives, which it probably is, then it still probably isn't talking about the actual captives taken by Babylon to Babylon. And we'll get into that, right? So when we get to verse 2, right, this is where things start to get a little complicated. If we read over this verse very quickly, right, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and that literally is just like the valley of judgment, and will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and divided up my land, right? If we sort of just read over this very quickly, this sounds like something that hasn't happened yet. This sounds like, oh, Joel is continuing his end times or eschatological portion of his prophecy, right? Because it says right, God's going to judge all nations, which hasn't happened yet, and sounds like something that's going to happen at the end of time. However, this isn't really the case because, right, all nations are being judged on account of my people, my heritage, Israel, right? Not every nation did wrong to Israel back then, and that's especially true now, as the Israel that it was referring to is not a nation now. There is a nation of Israel, but that's not the same nation that is being referred to here. So, right, this verse isn't necessarily being entirely literal. It says God's going to judge every nation on account of what they have done to Israel. And then, right, the very beginning of verse 1 sort of keys us in that this is a new direction for the prophecy. So this isn't a continuation of the end times or eschatological element of the prophecy, but Joel's sort of going in a new direction. The phrase, in those days and at that time, is a phrase used in the prophets especially, sort of keys you in that this is sort of a change of direction. The first two verses are in reference to, of chapter 3, are in reference to God bringing back the economy, the agriculture, and potentially people of Judah, and judging those nations who have caused this, economic downfall or caused the displacement of these people to begin with. And this is sort of an important distinction here that we didn't see in chapter 2, because in chapter 2, right, it mentions specifically judgment against Babylon for what they've done, and now the net's sort of being cast a little bit wider, because verse, 4 mentions Tyre, Sidon, and Philistia, or the nations of Philistia. Right, so the net of judgment's being cast even wider. No longer is Babylon the sole target of God's judgment after he judges Judah. Right, no longer is Babylon now the sole target of God's judgment, but now it is all of the nations who have taken Judah's fortunes and potentially taken some of Judah's people, either directly like Babylon or more indirectly, as some of these other nations seem to be. Right, verse 3 mentions that these nations have cast lots for my people, right, and this indicates that in addition to God judging these nations for their participation in the economic thing, they also will be judged, like we said, for their participation in the displacement of the Israelite people, though this is in a much smaller way than Babylon will be judged eventually. Right, so we have Tyre, Sidon, and Philistia mentioned here. And I mentioned very briefly in chapter 1, probably in the background section, which at this point was like 20 days ago or so. I mentioned very briefly that Tyre and Sidon specifically had benefited from the destruction of Jerusalem. Even before its destruction, even when Judah was still a somewhat prospering kingdom, they had participated in the slave trade. One commentator wrote this: people of these regions were seafaring traders whose market for slaves around the Mediterranean fueled their interest in both buying captured Israelite prisoners of war and capturing some for sale elsewhere, especially to the Greeks along the northern Mediterranean coast. Prior to Amos's time, which is the first half of the 8th century, so this is even before the northern kingdom fell, both groups had sold Israelite captives to Edom. And by Ezekiel's day, which is during the Babylonian exile, so after Joel, Tyre's slave trade with Greece was well established. So basically, right, Tyre and Sidon, way before and way after Joel, had been capturing and selling Israelites and Judean slaves. And now God is promising judgment upon them, just as God promised judgment upon Babylon, who caused the destruction of Jerusalem and the economic and agricultural things that came from that, and the displacement of people, right? And 2:20 specifically, um, chapter 2, verse 20, I will remove far away from you the northern army, Babylon, drive him into a barren and desolate land with his face towards the eastern sea, his back towards the western sea, his stench will come up, foul odor will rise, right? All of this is talking about Babylon. So too here, God is now promising judgment on all these nations that benefited from what Babylon did. Babylon came in and sieged Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem, but these other nations benefited from it. They, right? What is it? What does it say that they did? Right? They scattered, the people among the nations. So we see the slave trade that we talked about, and then even right, you've taken my silver, my gold, carried my into your temples, my prized possessions. The people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem you sold to the Greeks. So, right, the net of judgment's being cast even wider now to these sort of lesser nations that also helped with the downfall of Judah. So that was a long answer to a very simple question, but no, this is probably not a reference to the specific captives of Judah taken to Babylon, living in Babylon, right? This is probably, if it's translated as fortunes, then it's talking about fortunes, but the fortunes that were taken by the smaller nations of Tyre, Sidon, and the city-state nations of Philistia. If it is in reference to actual people, then it's in reference to the people that, once again, were taken by Tyre and Sidon and the nations of Philistia. Probably not Babylon. So, anyway, so that whole section sort of covers the first, 6 verses of sort of listing out all the things that Tyre and Sidon and these nations of Philistia have done. Then we get to verse 7, I will raise them out of the place to which you have sold them, and will return your retaliation upon your own head. And then we get to verse 8. I will sell your sons and your daughters. This is talking a prophecy against Tyre and Sidon and these Philistine nations. I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hands of the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, to a people far off, for the Lord has spoken. So my question is, and you need to really be thinking back to Mosaic time. How do we make sense of verse 8? Right, I will essentially, God is going to sell these foreign nations into slavery at the hands of Judah, and the Judah's going to sell them to the Sabaeans. Is such an act biblically and morally justified? Right? Because we, 2 centuries or so ago, stood up and said, slavery is not biblical, not what God wants. And right now we have God specifically, seemingly encouraging slavery as long as it's, helping Judah. So how do we make sense of this? No one wants to be the brave person to answer the somewhat politically charged question.
Come on, Lester.
I got myself in trouble the last time. 50 chance.
Well, let's just ask an even simpler question, right? Does the Bible condone slavery?
It usually was a form of judgment, wasn't it?
Not always. Right. So,
A lot of times it was. They were sent into,
The captivity to Babylon was.
But then there was Joseph, and what his brothers intended for that to be a dire circumstance turned out good for Judah.
right. But y'all are thinking specifically like Israelite people in slavery, right? Does the Bible condone slavery
In general,
in general?
I don't think so.
Could the Israelites have slaves?
They did.
they did, whether they should have or not.
Right. So let's break this down, okay? So
Thank you.
for starters, we need to understand at least two things about this time and the place in which Joel's prophecy is coming from. So the first is that pretty much for all of human history up until very recently, and when I say recently, that doesn't mean like 20 years ago. That means, you can call the last 1,000 years of human history recent history. But up until very recently, it was just the normal that you would go to war and you would take prisoners and you would capture them and you would sell them off. And that was normal. And right, the buying, the selling, and even the reselling of slaves was just a normal part of life that many people did not consider the morality of. It was just sort of a way of life. Second thing that we need to understand is that the Old Testament itself expects for slaves of war to be acquired. And it even has rules as to how they should be treated. Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, talk about female captives of war and how they should be treated. We don't have much details about how men captives of war were to be treated because the men were often killed either in battle or afterwards once the city was taken. They would just kill the men. Right, so the Bible, in Bible times, slavery was normal. Many people did not think about it. And also the Bible itself expects slavery and has rules regarding it. So keep that in mind. And then this brings up a whole lot of questions because not only are we not dealing with women captives of war, but right, we're dealing with people who were captives of war and now are just captives or now are just slaves, right? Because Judah did not take these people as captives of war, right? Judah was just sold these people as just normal slaves, not, slaves that Judah captured during wartime. So now, what is the Old Testament expectation regarding just the selling or the reselling of slaves? Since we're not, at this point, once Judah has them, they're not really captives of war anymore. They're just slaves. So what is the biblical expectation regarding the selling and reselling of slaves? So the Israelites were allowed to own slaves. Leviticus 25, verses 44, 45, and 46 allow the Israelites to buy male and female slaves from the nations around them. So if we're arguing purely from a biblical perspective in the Old Testament era, slavery was permissible. So Judah buying and then selling off these slaves, right, from these nations who had done the same thing to Judah, by the way, was biblically justified. Right, and it might be hard to wrap our heads around this because none of us have grown up in a time of slavery. We didn't grow up around either in slavery or seeing slavery, and it's so ingrained, especially in American culture, how evil slavery is, and it is. So it's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around how God can use slavery, and condone it at the hands of his own people. Right? But the issue of slavery in the Bible is very similar to the issue of polygamy, which is also a very politically charged thing that we don't like to talk about. Right? But the Old Testament also expects polygamy. It expects that it will happen, and there are rules about how it should be practiced in the Old Testament law. With societies and cultures evolved, right? Polygamy and slavery both gradually fell out of favor. And nowadays, right, with slavery and polygamy, it would be sinful to practice these things because they're illegal, right? Not just in the U.S. In the case of slavery, not just in the U.S. It's not like you go start your own nation and have slaves and say, well, the Bible says this is fine, right? Because slavery is actually, like you're going to get like nuked by NATO if you do that because it's like against international law. Right, slavery now, we can't do that. But right, in the time of the Old Testament, right, it was expected and there were rules about how it should be done and it was permissible. And so God uses something in the time of Joel, or technically a little bit after the time of Joel, uses something that today we see as moral evil. We should never do this. And he uses this to get vengeance on these people. Why? Because this is the same thing that they did to Judah and to the people of Judah, right? He prefaces this verse with all this, I will enter into judgment with these nations on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. And then we drop down, also the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem, who you have sold to the Greeks, that you may remove them far from their borders, right? So God is, once again, like we've seen all throughout the minor prophets, if you've been with me over, the last however many lessons we've done over the minor prophets, God is flipping the tables. And what these nations did to Judah, God is now doing to these nations. Even though we look at this and we say, this does not seem like a morally justifiable thing, it was. And there was nothing immoral or unbiblical about it. So hopefully that made sense.
Would when one nation conquered another nation, would that not making slaves out of the people they conquered, would that be kind of a natural outcome of conquering another nation?
Yeah.
Either kill them or make slaves out of them?
Yeah, I mean, especially at the time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
That's just, like I said, that's just kind of how the way that the world works is you went and you conquered another nation, you made prisoners of war. Yeah. You either had them as prisoners of war to serve your nation or you sold them off to other nations as slaves to work the fields or whatever, That's just the way that the world was, right?
That probably still goes on in some parts of the world today, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I want to say this or not because this is very politically charged, right? But we kind of do the same thing. We just don't like to call it that, right? But we go fight a foreign nation in war. We take some prisoners of war. What is that? It's just slavery, basically. We lock them to cell. We feed them once a day. It's basically slavery. I mean, but we don't necessarily like to see it like that. But that's
slavery in a different form.
Slavery in a different form, right? So yeah, I mean, like you said, yeah, this the natural outcome of conquering another nation is you're going to enslave another nation, and to an extent, the same thing kind of happens today. Although there's supposed to be anyway rules about how that's done, but
humanitarian purposes.
Humanitarian purposes. Okay, we're all good. I think.
Did we answer the question?
Was it yes?
Right. Well, I thought we answered the question, right?
Lester, you going to say no?
No.
Right. Right. Is such an action biblically and morally justified? Yes. Right. There you go. So verses 9 through 16, I could have potentially just gone through the end of the chapter, because for the last set of verses I only ended up with one question. But I thought that verse 16 was kind of a good stopping point. So we'll just read those set of verses. So, proclaim this among the nations, prepare for war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the wheat say, I am strong. Assemble and come, all you nations, and gather together all around. Cause your mighty ones to go down there, O Lord. Let the nations be wakened, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, go down, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and moon will grow dark, and the stars will diminish their brightness. The Lord also will roar from Zion, and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth will shake, but the Lord will be a shelter for his people, and the strength of the children of Israel. Okay, so I asked the question, how does Joel blend the language of the prophetic timelines in these verses? I think the easier question, and maybe the more helpful one, is you remember the three prophetic timelines we talked about? If you were taking notes on the summary portion, I spelled it out for you, right? But what are sort of the three prophetic timelines or prophetic emphases of chapter 2 of Joel? Well, we just talked about it. You have the immediate prophetic timeline, right? Babylon is going to be destroyed. Then you have sort of the New Testament emphasis or timeline, right? God's Spirit will be on all people. Pentecost, right? And then you have the eschatological or the end times emphasis with the sun turning darkness and the moon turning to blood and all that crazy stuff that people get worked up about. So then here, Joel seemingly blends the language of these prophetic timelines. So which of the three prophetic timelines that we talked about does Joel borrow that language from in these sets of verses that we just read? Right? Which of the prophetic timelines from chapter 2 do these sets of verses seem to call back to?
Revelation.
Right, Revelation, the end time, right? The third prophetic timeline that we talked about, right? Joel seems to borrow some of his own or some of God's language that he used in chapter 2, verse 10. So chapter 2, verse 10 is that's chapter 3. Chapter 2, verse 10 is the earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. So sun and moon are dark, stars diminishing their brightness. He's borrowing that in chapter 3, verse 15. The sun and moon will grow dark and the stars will diminish their brightness. Basically, verbatim, just quotes himself. And last time, when we went over chapter 2, we placed this as an eschatological or an end times aspect of Joel's prophecy. And I still hold to this, right? I'm not contradicting myself, right? However, the judgment being spoken of here in chapter 3, like we already said in the last set of questions, the last set of verses we read, is focused on these other surrounding nations who have wronged Judah. Tyre, Sidon, these Philistine city-state nations, right, and verse 2 of this chapter says that God will enter into judgment with them on account of my people, my heritage, Israel. So we have, or do we have? That's the question. We have this interpretation issue of, the judgment being poured out on these nations who have wronged Judah in chapter 3, yet we get to verse 15 of chapter 3, and we have language which we established in chapter 2 was talking about the end times. So how do we make sense of this? Right. Well, like I said last time, Joel never loses his focus. This is the same thing I want to stress now. The prophetic timelines, the prophetic emphases, however you want to call it, those change, and sometimes they change a lot in Joel. It can get confusing, but he never loses his focus on the faithful remnant and the unfaithful majority, either the unfaithful majority in Judah or the unfaithful majority of Babylon, or the unfaithful majority of these other surrounding nations of Tyre and Sidon and everything else. But the focus remains the same. And so I didn't necessarily get into this last chapter because it didn't really fit with the point I was trying to make, and honestly, it just goes better here. But the language used both in 2:10 and in 3:15, right? The 2:10, the sun and moon grow dark, the stars diminish the brightness. 3:15, the sun and moon will grow dark, and the stars will diminish the brightness. This language is covenantal language, right? When you talk about covenantal, right? Mount Sinai, Moses, people of Israel, that kind of covenantal language, right? And so the audience of the faithful remnant who is hearing this prophecy of Joel, they would have understood this. And they would have understood this and identified it with the covenant curses found in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy 28, verse 15 says, "It shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you." Skip down to verse 29 of that same chapter, and it says, "And you shall grope at noonday as a blind man gropes in darkness." Right? So Judah's hearing, I'm coming down to the valley of judgment with these surrounding nations of Tyre and Sidon and these Philistine nations, and they're going to have to make an account of what they did for you. Taking my treasures, taking my people, and selling y'all into slavery and all this stuff. And then now, God says, and the sun and moon will grow dark and the stars will diminish their brightness. And the people should have, anyway, been hearing this and went, oh, this is the covenantal curse language, right? God is essentially cursing these nations, right? God does not necessarily have a covenant with these nations. God does not have a covenant with Tyre and Sidon and these Philistine nations. But the meaning is the same. It's this sort of poetic language that the hearers would have understood and went, okay, this is God saying, I'm cursing these nations. Even the language that Joel uses when he changes his prophetic emphasis or prophetic timeline is still very relevant to his audience, which is the faithful remnant of Judah. So we have Joel using this language in chapter 3. So then the question is, right, what is the verse 15 of chapter 3 in reference to? Does this mean that chapter 3 as a whole isn't talking about a judgment of these surrounding nations and it's some far off eschatological end of the world type of thing? Does it mean that it's a prophecy that's only been partially fulfilled because he uses the same language here that he used in chapter 2 to talk about the end of the world type stuff? So maybe it was partially fulfilled but not completely fulfilled, right? Well, we need to sort of examine each aspect of the prophecy as its own thing, in its own right. Right? We mentioned before that chapter 3, Joel begins a new thought, a new section with the phrase, in these days, or in those days and at that time, verse 1. So Joel is not continuing his emphasis from the end of chapter 2. Further, we have the judgment of these nations. What is it a judgment on account of? On account of my people, my heritage, Israel. So, right, we can be pretty sure that this judgment is an event which, for us, has already happened. So then how do we make sense of the sort of blending of the language of the prophetic timelines, where now Joel is throwing in the sun and moon going dark and all of this? Well, like we said, he's emphasizing the surety, I think that's a word, the sureness of this judgment which is coming upon these nations of Tyre and Sidon and these Philistine nations. right? Joel does not repeat verbatim every single thing that he said in verses 30, 31, and 32 of chapter 2. There's no wonders of fire and smoke, and there's no moon turning to blood. So he doesn't repeat every single aspect of the eschatological emphasis and stick it in chapter 3. He repeats some of it, which is also, in addition to sounding end of the world-esque, is also, as we said, the covenantal curse language. So Joel specifically picked the covenantal curse language and put it in chapter 3 to show the surety of this coming judgment for these other nations. And God is essentially saying that he's cursing these other nations for what they have done. Just as in chapter 2, Joel, used this language to, and we placed it in an eschatological sort of time frame, but also, in a sense, right, Joel used this language to emphasize that God is cursing essentially the earth. Right, verse 30 of chapter 2, I will show wonders in the heavens and the earth. And then he talks about the sun being turned to darkness, and whereas the fire, the light, the stars don't give their light, and all this stuff. Right. So even though it is eschatological, it's also still covenantal curse language. Even in chapter 2, it's God essentially saying, "I'm going to show wonders in the earth, and I'm going to curse the earth." Essentially, right. Verse 16 of chapter 3. Describing the earth as shaking. Where I'm in Amos, that's why I can't find anything. The Lord also will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth will shake. All of that doesn't, we said verse 15 is sort of poetic language. It's the same for verse 16. That doesn't necessarily need to be interpreted literally as some sort of rapture movie, the ground is shaking, kind of thing. This is also covenantal language, right? One commentator wrote this, and this is very true, in the Old Testament at least, and perhaps in the New Testament also, all detailed statements regarding God's voice describe it as thunderous to the hearer. And so here it is enough to mention the roar of the all-powerful supreme commander to affirm that he has won the battle. So again, using this poetic language to emphasize the surety of God's judgment on these nations. So Joel mixes in, or as I said, kind of blends the language of these prophetic timelines in these verses, but the language here is symbolizing the surety of God cursing these nations and ultimately winning. Right? This is a battle that is, you're going to want to bet on God in this one.
He always wins.
Yeah, God always wins. Joel does not lose his focus here in chapter 3, just like we argued he doesn't lose his focus in chapter 2. Joel is concerned with God's judgment upon these other nations which have benefited from the fall of Judah. And that focus does not magically change as soon as we get to verse 15 and he starts throwing in this sun and moon going dark and the ground shaking kind of stuff. So anyway, that was a lot, but hopefully that all made sense. Okay. Given the context of the verses surrounding it and the overall message of chapter 3 as a whole, verse 10 of chapter 3, specifically the end, let the weak say, I am strong. What does this mean? I really, really want someone to take the bait and kind of fall for the trap that I have set, because it's so fun. Because it, if I sort of set this trick question, no one falls for it, I have to explain why it was a trick question. But if someone falls for it,
it'll be evident.
It'll be evident.
Well, they're going to be strong with God's help.
Who's going to be strong?
Whoever it is that's going to do the fighting here.
The remnant.
The remnant.
You've fallen for the trap. I love it. Right. Don't like feel bad or anything, obviously, but like
Oh, we won't.
right. yeah, this is like 100% not in reference to like being strong in the Lord or even a reference to the remnant of Judah at all. This is not in reference to Judah. This is in reference to Tyre, Sidon, and the nations of Philistia. Right? And when I read this, that's how I understood this. And then I was like, wait a minute. So I grew up, most of my life, we sang hymns. And there's this hymn that made its way into the hymnal. And now it just irritates me, and I never want to sing it again. But there's that hymn, and it says, and now let the weak say, I am strong. And, the whole time I'm singing that as a kid, I don't necessarily put two and two together. But I'm reading this, and I'm like, wait a minute. They just took this half of this verse from Joel and just put it in the song. And that is 100% not what the verse is talking about at all. Don't get your theology from music, okay? Like, that should be evident, but, like, yeah. Don't do that. But I consulted 4 different commentaries, and they all agree that they might differ on what exactly this war is referring to. Some commentaries place this whole chapter pretty much as an eschatological end of the world type of battle between good and evil. I don't really think that that's a good hermeneutic to apply here, but we can differ. But they all agree that the meaning of this verse is that this is a war of God's judgment upon the wicked that will involve the totality of the nations that God is judging. Or in other words, even the people who in a normal war would be considered too weak or unfit to fight would be called up to fight, right? This is like everybody getting drafted, everybody's on the front lines. And so that's that song, right? And now let the weak say, I am strong. And this idea of like, we're strong in the Lord, and God will give us strength, right? That in and of itself is a biblical concept, but right there is no other verse in the Bible with that exact wording other than Joel 3:10, and whoever wrote that song just came across Joel and's like, that would sound really good in the verse 2 of my song. They're like, that would sound great in a song. Let me just write a song about that. And that's not what this is about at all, right? They totally misapplied this verse. The reality is that this is saying that even the weak people of these nations, Tyre, Sidon, these Philistine nations, even the weak people who in a normal battle, they would say, we don't need you. You're too weak, you're too small, you're too old, you're too crippled, whatever. Even they will have to fight because this is such a large-scale battle and such a large-scale judgment. Right, so that's what it's saying. Proclaim this is verse 9, proclaim this among the nations that God's pouring out his judgment on. Prepare for war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. And then we get into verse 10, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears, right? Even the people who aren't warriors, these farmers have to make their farm equipment into weapons. And then it says, let the weak say, I am strong. Even the little weaklings, the people picked last on the playground, even they're going to have to go out to war. And that's what this verse is talking about. And this is important because, right, this whole chapter pretty much is about God judging these other smaller nations who have benefited from the destruction of Judah. And so, the overall message does not, change. It's very uniform throughout this chapter. And I actually meant to, on your copy of the, what you're supposed to fill out, I meant to put 2 bulleted points, one that says Tyre and one that says Sidon. Because I actually wanted to talk a little bit about them, and I guess you can just do that yourself if you're so inclined. But let's talk about historically these nations and what do we know about their downfall? And both of these nations had multiple downfalls over the years. So Tyre, in 586 BC, 1 year after the fall of Judah, Babylon began a 13-year siege of Tyre. If you know anything about sieges, especially ones that last longer than a year, it completely wrecks the economy. And that's the case for Tyre. It completely wrecked its economy, much like Judah's economy was described as being wrecked in chapter 1. Babylon did the same thing here, but seemingly even worse. Later on, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great once again put siege to Tyre, massacred 8,000 civilians, and sold off slavery, right? 30,000 people into slavery. We do not know this for sure. We have no historical record of Judah having slaves from Tyre or Sidon, but potentially sold some of these slaves into the hands of Judah, potentially as a fulfillment of verse 8 of chapter 3. So, right, all this judgment of Tyre and Sidon that we've been talking about, right, it definitely happened. We don't know exactly which time that these nations were under attack was like the judgment that God was prophesying, or that Joel was prophesying. But like, yeah, over the years, they've definitely suffered for what they did to Judah. So then Sidon, in the 4th century BC, during the reign of Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes led an army of 330,000 people, plus several thousand others from surrounding nations. He led this giant army against Sidon, and he burned the city completely, killed 40,000 people, and then sold the ruins of the city. And he is also said to have sold Sidonians into slavery, once again, potentially into the hands of Judah as a fulfillment of verse 8 of chapter 3. So, anyway, I just sort of added that to show that, right, this is events that, right, for us have already happened, but, right, God kept his word and he judged these nations. Right, so as said earlier, this verse is not, as the song would have you to believe, referring to God's people being strengthened by the Lord. It's not the remnant that's being strengthened for war, right? Because at this point, the prophecy, we're already talking about events after the fall of Judah. So it's not talking about the remnant being strengthened when Babylon comes to fight. Because now we're talking about judgment against Tyre and Sidon and these Philistine nations, which is after the fall of Judah. So it's not talking about God strengthening anyone to begin with, but it's not talking about God strengthening the remnant. It's talking about, right, the weak of these nations that normally would not be fit to fight are going to have to pick themselves up and fight, because this is going to be such a large-scale judgment of God that they're going to need every available man to fight this war. And we don't need to study Bibles or commentaries to figure this out. The key is in the context. So the last set of verses, starting with verse 17 through the end of the chapter. So you shall know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. Then Jerusalem shall be holy, and no alien shall ever pass through her again. It will come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drip with new wine, the hills shall flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah shall be flooded with water. A fountain shall flow from the house of the Lord, and water the valley of Acacias. Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness, because of violence against the people of Judah, for they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall abide forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. For I will acquit them of the guilt of bloodshed, whom I had not acquitted, for the Lord dwells in Zion. In that last verse, the way that I read it, and depending on your translation, might read differently, doesn't really make any sense at all. In the New King James, and whoever was responsible for translating this verse kind of butchered it, because really this is actually a question, and it should read, will I acquit them of the guilt of their bloodshed? No, I have not acquitted them. Something like that. Basically, God's saying, you're not off the hook. For the Lord dwells in Zion. So anyway, there's only one question for this set of verses. What are the 3 blessings that Judah will experience in verse 17, right? So this is like ultra easy. All you have to do is just repeat back to me what the chapter said. No need for study Bibles required. Right? So there's sort of like 3 blessings that Judah will experience here. What are they?
The dwelling of the Lord.
The presence of God.
In Jerusalem, Jerusalem will be holy.
Holiness. The presence of God, holiness.
And never again will anybody invade it.
Which, what does that mean?
But no one's going to invade it in the future.
Yes, but like what would we call this?
Protected, right?
Peace, right? Not wartime,
peace,
but peace, right?
Yeah.
3 blessings: God's presence, holiness, and peace. Right? Contrasting the curse language used in the same chapter against Tyre, Sidon, and these cities of Philistia, Joel now uses blessing language, also found in the Mosaic covenant. Jerusalem shall have God's presence, shall have holiness, and shall have peace. And there's, you're going to kill me for this because this whole time I've been saying that Joel doesn't lose his focus, and then here I am saying there's sort of a change of focus here. In a sense, there's a change of focus in a sense from focusing on these foreign nations of Tyre and Sidon to focusing on Judah itself, right? And this is sort of this makes sense, right? This is the end of the prophecy. This is sort of Joel's last word, and you want to leave it on a positive note. If you're sitting here listening to this, you're like, okay, probably after I'm dead, God's gonna, judge Tyre and Sidon and these Philistine nations. What does this have to do with me? I'm here in Judah. Before Judah's even fallen, I'm here listening to this. What does it have to do with me? So it kind of makes sense that he would shift at the very end and sort of focus on Judah itself. Right? These people who are listening to this, who have heard of the soon coming destruction of Judah and Jerusalem, they can now rest assured that not only will Babylon and these other nations who have caused the downfall of Judah, not only will they be dealt with, but Jerusalem itself will prosper again. And this is very important for the people listening. It's not just that God is getting vengeance on behalf of Judah, but God is also going to build Judah up again. Right? Jerusalem will be God's dwelling place once more. Jerusalem will be holy once more. And Jerusalem will have peace once more. And all of these things certainly happened after the exile in different periods of history. However, right, this part anyway has actually not been completely fulfilled. And this is, interesting because I've argued that, chapter 3, right, most of this up until really we got into like verse 17, all of this has been stuff that's like already sort of happened for us. This is a prophecy. This is judgment against these other smaller nations that benefited from the destruction of Jerusalem. Taking things from Judah and Jerusalem, taking slaves and selling them to the Greeks. That's true. But, right, when it focuses on Judah and the blessings that are to come to Judah, not all of this was fulfilled after the, after the exile, and not all of this is even fulfilled for us today. Right, because we know that there is coming a day in which God will dwell in Zion or in Jerusalem, right? Revelation 21, 2 and 3, right? The new heaven and the new earth, and the tabernacle of God is with men, right? And God will dwell in Zion permanently, and the city will experience peace and holiness permanently. And so, right, just because I argue that the majority of chapter 3 is referring to the judgment of these smaller nations, and it's something that's already happened for us, and it's not really eschatological or end of the world. Don't think for a moment that this chapter has nothing applicable for us today, and that this is all just stuff that's happened in the past, right? Right, because the remnant of God in Joel's time was awaiting peace on earth, quite literally, and that's what we're waiting for too. We're waiting for the return of Christ and peace on earth. Peace, holiness, and the physical dwelling of God is what we're waiting for, just as the people, the remnant of God in Joel's time were as well. So it's very applicable to us today. Right, well, with the remnant of the people of Judah, immediately before the exile awaited the 3 things we listed, God's presence, holiness, and peace, so too do the remnant of God in the whole world, today await. We just might have to, live through some years of destruction and exile and war before we can get to the years of peace and holiness and God's presence. So anyway, very positive note to end on. So that's what I like about Joel.
A good ending.
Good ending. Okay. Any questions on like anything we've talked about? Because we covered everything from like, the history of Tyre and Sidon being under siege to like slavery in the Old Testament. So we've covered a lot. Good. Okay. Congratulations. We finished Joel.
There will be no final test.
No final test. Right.
Not here anyway.
Okay. So in that case, I'll hand it over to Lester for the prayer.